She had cooked his meals, raised his children, and kept his secrets for 12 years. Tonight, Marcus Webb was about to accuse her of the one thing she never did. Standing in the doorway of his own home, he watched Denise Carter, the woman he called family, slip a bag into a stranger's hands under the cover of night. Marcus had built an empire from nothing, and he had learned the hard way that trust was a currency few people deserved. Now, staring through the gap in his study curtains, he felt something in his chest go cold. Denise was stealing from him. What Marcus did not know that night was that the man waiting in the shadows outside his gate was not a thief. He was his own country's forgotten hero, and the woman Marcus was about to accuse had spent years protecting a secret far more painful than anything he could have imagined. Before we go further, tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. We would love to hear from you, and do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Marcus Webb had every reason to trust Denise Carter. She had been with his family since his youngest daughter was still in diapers, since his late wife's illness had left him unable to run a household on his own. Denise never asked for more than her wages, never complained, never gave him a single reason to doubt her. So when his private security system flagged unusual withdrawals from his home safe, and when the footage showed Denise slipping out past midnight to meet a man near the property line, Marcus felt betrayed in a way he had not felt since childhood. Who was the man waiting for her in the dark? Was Denise really stealing from the family that trusted her most? Or was there something happening in that house that Marcus had never once bothered to notice? And if the truth came out, would Marcus be ready to face what he had gotten so completely wrong about the people closest to him? To understand what happened that night, you have to understand who Denise Carter really was before she ever stepped foot in Marcus Webb's mansion. She grew up in a small town outside Atlanta, the daughter of a preacher and a schoolteacher, raised on the belief that hard work and quiet dignity could carry a person through anything. Her father preached every Sunday about the value of service, and her mother taught third grade for 30 years without ever once raising her voice at a child. Denise grew up watching two people give everything they had to others and ask for almost nothing in return, and somewhere in that small house, she absorbed the same instinct without ever realizing it would come to define the rest of her life. At 19, she enlisted in the Army, trained as a combat medic, and was deployed overseas twice before she turned 25. She rarely spoke of those years, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much. She had held soldiers' hands as they took their last breaths in places whose names she never repeated at home. She had learned to keep her hands steady when everything around her was falling apart, a skill that would serve her again years later in ways she never expected. What she brought home instead of medals or stories was a son, Elijah Carter, born just months after she returned from her second tour, and a determination that he would never know the kind of hardship she had known overseas or the hardship she had known growing up before that. Denise raised Elijah alone, working double shifts as a home health aide before she was hired by the Webb family. She was proud, private, and fiercely protective of the one thing she had left to protect. She never remarried, never spoke much of Elijah's father, and poured every ounce of the discipline she had learned in the Army into raising a son who would grow up steady, respectful, and strong. She taught him to make his bed every morning, to shake a man's hand firmly, to never raise his voice even when the world gave him every reason to. She did not know, not fully, how much of her own military bearing she had passed down to him until the day he came home in an Army uniform of his own, telling her he had enlisted at 19, the very same age she had once enlisted herself. Marcus Webb, for his part, had not always lived behind gated walls and marble floors. He grew up in a two-bedroom apartment in Detroit, the son of a factory worker who lost his job when Marcus was only 11. He remembered nights with no heat, weeks of eating nothing but rice and beans, and a mother who worked two jobs just to keep the lights on. He remembered the shame of wearing the same pair of shoes for 3 years straight, the soles held together with tape his mother applied every Sunday night before school. He remembered promising himself, somewhere around age 13, that he would never again feel as powerless as he felt watching his father sit at the kitchen table staring at unpaid bills with a look Marcus never wanted to see on another human face again. That childhood had shaped him into a man who built one of the most successful logistics companies in the country, starting with a single delivery truck he financed with a loan no bank wanted to give him. He worked 18-hour days for the better part of a decade, sacrificing relationships, sleep, and at times his own health, until the business grew into something that employed thousands of people across the country. But that same childhood had also shaped him into a man who trusted almost no one completely. He had learned that people who seemed loyal could disappear the moment money got tight, because he had watched it happen to his own father, abandoned by business partners the moment the factory showed signs of trouble. He loved his children, he respected Denise, but somewhere underneath his success, he still carried the fear that everything could be taken from him again, the same way it had been taken from his father. Marcus had married young, a woman named Angela who understood his drive because she shared it, a nurse who worked nights while he built his company during the day. When Angela passed away after a long illness 8 years ago, Marcus had thrown himself even further into his work, partly out of grief, partly because building something enormous felt like the only way to make sense of losing something he could not control. Denise had been there through all of it, through the funeral, through the sleepless nights that followed, through 2 children who needed someone steady in a house that had suddenly lost its center. Marcus had never said it out loud, but Denise Carter had become, in every way that mattered, the closest thing to family he had left outside his own children. What neither of them knew was that their 2 very different pasts were about to collide in a single truth that neither one saw coming. Elijah Carter, the boy Denise had raised to be strong and self-reliant, had followed his mother's footsteps into the military. He had served 2 tours overseas, earned commendations for bravery under fire, and returned home 18 months ago carrying wounds that no one could see. During his second tour, Elijah's unit had been moving through a narrow mountain pass just before dawn when gunfire erupted from the ridgeline above them, pinning the entire squad against rock walls with nowhere to take real cover. His sergeant, a man named Carl who had trained Elijah since his very first week in the unit, went down hard less than 20 feet from Elijah's position, hit in the leg and unable to move on his own. Every instinct told Elijah to stay low, to wait for support, to do what the training manuals called the safe thing. He did not. He crawled forward through open ground while rounds struck the dirt inches from his hands, reached Carl, and began dragging him back toward cover by his vest straps, his own body exposed the entire distance. The quarter-mile back to safety took nearly 11 minutes, each one of them under continued fire, Elijah's arms burning, his hearing dulled to a ringing static from explosions close enough to knock dust from the rocks above them. When he finally reached the extraction point, he collapsed beside Carl, checked his pulse with hands that would not stop shaking, and stayed conscious just long enough to confirm his sergeant would live before the adrenaline gave out completely. Command recommended him for a commendation within the week. Elijah accepted it in a quiet ceremony, said little, and never once mentioned the details to his own mother, not because he did not trust her, but because some things felt too heavy to hand to the person who had already given him everything. He came home to a country that thanked him with a handshake and a folded flag ceremony, then largely left him to figure out the rest on his own. He had trouble finding steady work, trouble sleeping through the night, and a quiet pride that kept him from asking his mother for help even as his savings ran out and his car became the only place he had left to sleep on his hardest nights. He applied to warehouse jobs, security positions, anything that would take a man with his particular set of skills, and time after time, he was told the position had already been filled or that his experience did not translate to civilian work, or simply nothing at all. No response, no explanation. Denise knew none of the details, only that her son was struggling, and she had begun quietly setting aside small amounts of food and household items from the Webb estate, believing she was doing nothing more than helping her own child survive. For weeks, small things had gone unnoticed in the Webb household. A few unused grocery items here, some extra linens there, nothing that seemed significant enough for anyone to question. Denise had always been careful, taking only what she believed would otherwise go to waste, leftover food from dinners the family never finished, blankets stored away in closets nobody had opened in years. She told herself it was not stealing if the items were never going to be used or missed. She told herself Marcus, of all people, would understand if he only knew the full picture. But she had also learned, over 12 years in that house, that some conversations were easier to avoid than to have, and so she said nothing, carrying her secret the same way she had once carried secrets overseas, quietly and alone. But when a routine audit flagged a larger sum missing from the home's safe, an amount far greater than any grocery item could account for, Marcus's head of security brought the matter directly to him, along with footage of Denise leaving the property late at night, carrying a bag she had never carried before. Marcus watched the footage twice, then a third time, hoping he had misread what he was seeing. He had known Denise for over a decade. He had trusted her with his children, his home, and his most private moments of grief after his wife passed. Now he was being told that the same woman may have been stealing from him for weeks, possibly longer, and handing off whatever she took to someone waiting for her in the dark just beyond his gate. His head of security, a former police detective named Raymond Hughes, laid out the timeline for Marcus in blunt terms. The missing funds coincided almost exactly with Denise's late-night departures. The man she met near the gate had never been identified, his face obscured by shadow and a low-hanging cap in every angle the cameras captured. Raymond suggested, carefully, that this had the markings of an inside job, the kind he had seen before in 20 years on the force, a trusted employee slowly bleeding a family dry while hiding behind years of goodwill. Marcus wanted to dismiss the idea outright. But the footage was the footage, and the numbers did not lie, at least not in the way Raymond presented them. Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. Rather than confronting Denise immediately or calling the police, he chose to follow her the next time she left the house. Part of him told himself he needed proof before making an accusation that could destroy a woman's life. Another part of him, quieter and harder to admit, simply needed to see the truth with his own eyes before he could believe it. His own daughter, Kayla, now a teenager, had asked him at dinner that week why he seemed so distracted, and Marcus had brushed off the question, unwilling to voice the suspicion eating away at him until he knew for certain whether it was justified. That night, when Denise's car pulled out of the driveway just after 11, Marcus followed at a careful distance, his headlights off, his heart pounding harder than it had in years. He told himself he was protecting his family. He did not yet understand that he was about to uncover a story far bigger than any theft. His hands stayed tight on the wheel the entire drive, every red light forcing him to fall back further than he wanted. Every turn Denise's car took pulling him deeper into a version of the city he had spent years driving past on his way to somewhere else. He caught himself rehearsing what he would say if she noticed him, and then rehearsing what he would say if the man waiting for her turned out to be exactly what Raymond suspected. The drive took nearly 40 minutes, winding out of the quiet, manicured streets of his neighborhood and into a part of the city Marcus rarely had reason to visit, past shuttered storefronts and streetlights that flickered instead of holding steady. Twice he nearly lost her taillights at a stretch where the road narrowed and the street lamps gave out completely, and both times his chest tightened at the thought of losing the one lead that might finally answer the question that had kept him awake for the better part of a week. He had donated to causes in this part of the city before, writing checks from the comfort of his office, but he had never once driven through it himself after dark, and the distance between the life he funded and the life he actually witnessed struck him harder with every passing block. Denise's car eventually slowed near a modest gathering of trailers and temporary housing units, the kind of transitional lot Marcus had seen mentioned in charity reports but had never once visited himself. He watched her park, step out with the same bag security had flagged on camera, and walk toward a group of men standing near a fire barrel, its light casting long shadows against the trailers behind them. One of them stepped forward to meet her. He was tall, quiet, moving with the careful discipline of someone trained to carry himself a certain way, shoulders squared even in the cold, eyes scanning the surroundings out of habit rather than suspicion. Marcus sat frozen in his car, staring at the exchange, unsure whether he was about to catch a thief in the act or about to learn something about Denise Carter he had never bothered to ask. Marcus stayed in his car longer than he meant to, watching Denise hand the bag to the man by the fire barrel, watching him nod in a way that felt less like gratitude for stolen goods and more like the quiet respect of one soldier acknowledging another. Marcus told himself he was imagining things. He stepped out of his car, walked closer than he probably should have, his shoes crunching against loose gravel loud enough that several of the men near the barrel turned toward the sound. That is when Denise turned and saw him standing there. For a moment, neither of them said a word. Denise did not look guilty. She looked exhausted, and beneath the exhaustion, something closer to relief, as though a weight she had carried alone for months had finally been seen by someone else. The man beside her stepped forward, introducing himself simply as a friend of the family, his voice calm, and even despite the tension thick enough to feel in the cold night air. Marcus recognized something in the way he stood, shoulders squared, eyes steady, the posture of a man trained for combat rather than crime. When Marcus asked Denise directly what was happening, she did not make excuses. She told him the truth, plainly and without apology. The bag contained nothing but leftover food, hand-me-down clothing, and a few unused household supplies she had been quietly setting aside for weeks. She was not stealing from Marcus. She was trying to help the men living in that lot, veterans who had served their country and come home to nothing, men the system had quietly forgotten. Marcus looked past Denise for the first time, really looked, at the small collection of trailers and the handful of men gathered around that barrel for warmth. He noticed a folded American flag draped carefully over the hood of one truck. He noticed dog tags hanging from a rearview mirror. He noticed that these were not strangers loitering in the dark, but men who had once worn the same uniform his own father had once saluted at 4th of July parades back in Detroit. Something in Marcus's chest, the same cold suspicion he had carried all the way here, began to shift into something else entirely. Marcus asked why she had never simply told him. Denise's answer struck him harder than any accusation could have. She said she had been afraid that if she asked for help, even in the smallest way, he might see her differently, might wonder whether she could still be trusted to manage his home and his children. She said she had learned a long time ago that people who ask for too much are often the first to be replaced, a lesson she had carried since childhood, and one that had only hardened after years of watching hardworking people around her lose everything for asking a single favor too many. Marcus stood in silence, beginning to understand that the walls he had built to protect himself from betrayal had also taught the people around him to hide their own struggles rather than risk his disappointment. It was only then that Marcus turned his attention to the quiet man who had accepted the bag from Denise. Something about him felt familiar in a way Marcus could not immediately place, a resemblance he could not quite name until the man spoke again. When he asked the man's name, the answer stopped him cold. The man introduced himself as Elijah Carter. Marcus turned slowly to look at Denise, the pieces of the last several weeks rearranging themselves in his mind all at once. The man he had suspected of receiving stolen goods was not a stranger at all. He was Denise's own son, a decorated combat veteran, and the missing piece of a story Marcus had almost destroyed with his own suspicion before ever learning the truth. Marcus stood there in the dim light of the fire barrel, staring at Elijah Carter, unable to reconcile the man in front of him with the thief he had convinced himself he was chasing. Denise finally spoke, her voice steady despite the tears she no longer tried to hide. She told Marcus that Elijah had served 2 tours overseas, had carried wounded soldiers to safety under fire, and had come home to a country that handed him a folded flag of gratitude and then left him to fend for himself. He could not find steady work. He could not sleep through the night without waking in a panic. He had been sleeping in his car for weeks, too proud to tell his own mother how bad things had become, until she found out on her own and began quietly funneling whatever she could spare from the Webb household to keep her son alive. Elijah spoke for himself then, his voice low but unwavering, describing the ambush that had earned him a commendation nobody outside his unit ever heard about. The sergeant he had carried across open ground while bullets tore through the dirt around them both. He described coming home to job interviews that ended the moment he mentioned his combat deployments, as though his service made him a liability rather than an asset. He described the particular kind of loneliness that comes from surviving something unimaginable only to find that no one at home wants to hear about it, and the quiet shame of a grown man needing his mother to feed him. Marcus asked Elijah why he had never reached out for help through any of the veteran programs that existed for exactly this purpose. Elijah's answer was quiet but firm. He said he had applied to several, including a scholarship and job placement fund he had heard about through a local VA office, but he never heard back, and after enough silence, a man stops asking. Marcus felt something shift in his chest at those words, because he recognized the name of that very fund. It was one he had created and funded himself years earlier, quietly, without his name attached, meant to help veterans exactly like Elijah rebuild their lives. Somewhere between his office and the men who needed that help, The system Marcus had built to do good had failed the very person standing in front of him. Marcus asked Raymond, his head of security, to pull the fund's application records the very next morning, and what he found sickened him. Elijah's application, along with dozens of others, had been sitting untouched in a queue for months, buried under an administrative backlog nobody at the company had thought important enough to flag to Marcus directly. Men who had risked everything overseas had been reduced to a folder gathering dust in an office 3 floors below Marcus's own, a detail that would haunt him far longer than the missing funds ever had. Raymond also returned to the original discrepancy that had started everything, the larger sum flagged missing from the home safe. A closer review showed it had nothing to do with Denise at all. A bookkeeping error in the household accounting system, compounded by a temporary contractor who had mismanaged a separate reimbursement account weeks earlier, had thrown off the numbers entirely. Denise had never touched a cent that was not freely hers to give away. Marcus felt the weight of that discovery settle over him fully, realizing he had let one honest mistake in a spreadsheet convince him that the most loyal person in his household was a thief. Marcus stood in that quiet lot long after the fire barrel had burned low, staring at the man his own foundation had failed without ever knowing his name. For the first time in years, Marcus Webb felt something closer to shame than pride, and he understood that the walls he had built to protect his fortune had also blinded him to the very people that fortune was supposed to help. He did not offer an apology wrapped in charity. He offered something far more personal. He asked Elijah to come work directly under him, overseeing logistics and security for the company Marcus had spent his life building, not as a token gesture, but because he recognized in Elijah the same discipline and resourcefulness that had built his own empire from nothing. Denise tried to protest, telling Marcus he owed her family nothing, that she had only done what any mother would do. Marcus stopped her gently and told her she was wrong. He said she had spent 12 years quietly holding his family together while silently holding her own together as well, and he had never once thought to ask what she needed in return. He offered her a partnership in a new foundation, one that would carry her name alongside his, dedicated to making sure no veteran who reached out for help would ever again be met with silence. Denise wept, not from sadness, but from the release of a burden she had carried alone for far too long. In the weeks that followed, Marcus personally reviewed every application sitting in that neglected queue, calling each veteran himself rather than delegating the task to someone else. Several of the men from that fire barrel lot found themselves in interviews within days, men who had been told for months that no one wanted a soldier with their particular history. Raymond Hughes, humbled by how badly he had misread the situation from the very beginning, volunteered to help rebuild the program's outreach from the ground up, determined that no application would ever again sit forgotten under his watch. Within months, Elijah had moved out of his car and into a home Marcus helped him secure near the same lot where dozens of other veterans still waited for someone to notice them. He did not forget them. Together with Denise and Marcus, Elijah helped expand the very program that had once overlooked him, this time built with follow-through, real phone calls returned, and real doors opened. The lot where fires once burned in barrels for warmth slowly transformed into a transitional housing center with Elijah's name on the front office door, a place built by someone who understood exactly what it felt like to be forgotten. A year later, at the ribbon cutting for that same center, Marcus stood beside Denise and Elijah as a small crowd of veterans and their families gathered to see the building finished. Kayla, Marcus's daughter, stood nearby holding a framed photograph of her father as a boy in Detroit, a reminder Marcus had asked her to bring, so that everyone in that crowd would know the man cutting the ribbon had once stood exactly where they now stood, uncertain whether anyone would ever notice him either. Marcus Webb had set out that night to catch a thief in his own home. Instead, he found the truth about the woman who had quietly held his family together, and the son she raised whose courage had gone unseen by the very system meant to honor it. In the end, the only thing stolen that night was Marcus's assumption that loyalty and struggle could not exist in the same heart. Have you ever misjudged someone who was quietly carrying more than you ever knew? Let us know in the comments below, and also the part of Marcus and Denise's story that affected you the most. I will read every single one and respond personally. And if you have not already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories.